Get the hell out. This isn't a soup kitchen. The words, slick with venom and privilege, sliced through the grand ballroom of the Ashworth estate, sharper and colder than the diamond-cut crystal in every hand. The music from the string quartet didn't just falter. It died, strangled in a sudden, suffocating silence. A wave of stillness washed over the glittering assembly, but it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the predatory quiet of a pack of wolves that has just cornered its prey. Then came the laughter. Not a gentle titter, but a harsh, barking cruelty that ricocheted off the 24-carat gold-leaf ceilings and the priceless oil paintings of long-dead, smug-looking ancestors. At the epicenter of this hurricane of contempt stood Seraphina Jones, a woman whose skin was the color of rich earth and whose simple, elegant midnight blue dress was a quiet rebellion in a sea of ostentatious designer gowns. She clutched a glass of water, the condensation on its surface the only thing betraying the heat of the fury coiling in her belly. She had been inside the Billionaire's annual Legacy Gala for precisely 7 minutes, and the hosting family, the vaunted Ashworth clan, had already tried and convicted her of the crime of existing in their space. They didn't ask her name. They didn't inquire about her invitation. They saw her black skin, the humble grace with which she carried herself, and the absence of a screaming price tag on her attire, and their verdict was instantaneous. Trespasser. Now, before this powder keg truly explodes, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and that justice should be served, no matter the address, do me a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell stories here. We build a community that demands better. We are so glad you are here. Let's get back to the unfolding disaster at the Ashworth mansion. Tiffany Ashworth, the family's eldest daughter, and a woman whose smile was as sharp and thin as a shard of glass, glided closer. Her movements were a performance, designed for the audience she now commanded. She wanted everyone to hear, to witness, to participate in the humiliation. I do believe the catering staff was instructed to use the service entrance, she purred, her voice dripping with faux concern that was more insulting than any shout. Did you get lost on your way to the kitchen, darling? A fresh wave of laughter, louder this time, rolled across the ballroom. The guests, these titans of industry and doyens of high society, sipped their vintage champagne, their eyes sparkling not with joy, but with the gleam of shared cruelty. They were sharks tasting blood in the water, but Seraphina Jones did not flinch. She did not bow her head or avert her gaze. She stood there, her spine a rod of steel, her shoulders squared, as if the insults were nothing more than a foul wind that couldn't touch her. But inside, a firestorm of memory was raging. She knew this scene. She had lived this scene in different forms her entire life. At 21, a brilliant honors student on a full scholarship, she had been physically barred from a private donors' dinner. The security guard, looking right through her, had sneered. "The valet line is for guests, sweetheart." He'd pointed a thick finger toward the back alley where the dishwashers were smoking. At 27, after closing her first multi-million-dollar tech deal, she had treated herself to the presidential suite of a 5-star hotel. The clerk at the front desk had looked at her, then at her credit card, and had the audacity to call the bank to verify the funds, assuming it was stolen. The memory of his smug face as the bank manager personally vouched for her still made her jaw tighten. And now, tonight, 15 years and a global empire worth billions later, here it was again. The same sneering laughter, the same casual cruelty, The same suffocating arrogance that assumed her worth was determined by their judgment. Near the edge of the confrontation, a young waiter named Leo, balancing a tray of empty champagne flutes, froze. He was new, just a college kid trying to make tuition. He frowned, his eyes darting from the jeering faces of the Ashworths to the unshakable stillness of the woman in blue. He didn't know her name, not yet, but he knew what he was seeing. And something about her silence unnerved him. It wasn't the silence of fear or shame. It was the deep, patient silence of absolute control. It was the silence of a bomb before it detonates. Eleanor Ashworth, the family matriarch, a woman preserved in venom and diamonds, drifted in beside her daughter. She placed a hand on Tiffany's arm, a theatrical gesture of solidarity. "Darling, you don't have to pretend," she cooed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried across the hushed room. "We all know you didn't walk in here as a guest. People like you are always looking for a handout, a way to sneak in for free drinks and a taste of the good life." The room erupted again. This time phones were raised, not to defend her, not to document an injustice, but to capture the spectacle, to share the humiliation, to turn her pain into their entertainment for the night. This was the final, unforgivable blow. Carter Ashworth, the family's son and heir, a man barely 30 with the cruel, petulant face of a spoiled king, stepped forward. He lifted his glass of crimson-red wine, made a show of examining its color, and then, with a deliberate, theatrical slowness, he didn't just spill it. He poured it directly onto the lap of her navy dress, the scarlet liquid blooming across the fabric like a violent, accusing stain. The crowd gasped, a collective, sharp intake of breath. And then, obscenely, they clapped. They applauded as if this act of base cruelty were the crescendo of a magnificent performance. Serafina looked down at the stain, at the wine dripping onto the priceless Persian rug beneath her feet. She felt the wetness seeping through, cold against her skin. But her expression remained unchanged. Slowly, deliberately, she set her own glass of water down on a nearby marble-topped table. The click of the glass was the only sound in a room that had suddenly gone quiet again, waiting. When she lifted her head, her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a fire so cold it could burn. Her voice, when it came, was low, even, and devoid of any emotion except a terrifying certainty. It carried farther and with more weight than all of their laughter combined. "You will all regret this." The party didn't know it yet. The laughing, clapping, filming jesters in their gilded cage had no idea. But $5 billion of their collective future, the very foundation of the legacy they were celebrating, was about to evaporate into thin air. And the woman they were mocking, the woman they had just assaulted, was the one holding the detonator. The laughter hadn't quite faded when Tiffany Ashworth, emboldened by her brother's actions, stepped forward again. The sharp clicks of her Louboutin heels against the marble floor sounded like a drumbeat of arrogance. She began to circle Serafina, a predator sizing up its victim, her eyes narrowed with a look of theatrical disgust. "You're standing in a mansion that has hosted presidents, kings, and the architects of the modern world," she announced, her voice a weapon designed to inflict maximum damage. "And yet, here you stand, in a dress that looks like it came from a department store rack, thinking you have the right to breathe our air." A few guests had the decency to look uncomfortable, but most chuckled, hungry for the next act of this cruel play. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and schadenfreude. Serafina remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed, not on Tiffany, but on a point in the distance, as if looking straight through her. She was remembering other nights, other rooms, other faces, all bearing the same mask of contempt. She remembered being 23, standing in the rain outside a corporate skyscraper for a job interview, only to have security demand 3 forms of ID and proof that she wasn't a delivery worker. She remembered the silence in a boardroom in Tokyo, the condescending smiles from the all-male executive team as she laid out her revolutionary logistics algorithm. They had ignored her, talked over her, until the moment her projected revenue numbers that would make them all ludicrously wealthy, flashed on the screen, silencing them instantly. Tonight was just a louder, uglier version of the same old story. They mistook her silence for weakness. They always did. And they were always, always wrong. Eleanor Ashworth, dripping in diamonds that seemed to absorb and amplify the room's cruelty, glided back into the circle. She raised her own glass in a mock toast. "Sweetheart, you must be confused. People like you don't receive invitations to the Legacy Gala. You must have slipped past the guards when they were changing shifts." She turned to the assembled guests, a conspiratorial smirk on her face. "She's quite resourceful, you have to give her that." A fresh wave of laughter followed, weaker this time, but still there. The cruelty was no longer a whisper. It was the theme of the evening. At the edge of the ballroom, Leo the waiter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen her name. He had been helping the event coordinator check the master guest list just hours earlier. He remembered it distinctly because the name was unusual, and next to it was a note in bold red ink. "VIP 0 on. Greet on arrival. Notify Mr. Ashworth immediately." He hadn't known who she was, but he knew she was no intruder. His hand instinctively went to his phone in his pocket. The urge to record, to create a true record of what was happening, was a physical pull. But the fear of Tiffany's wrath, of losing a job he desperately needed, kept him paralyzed, a silent, unwilling accomplice. Then came the sharpest blow, the one that crossed the line from mockery to assault. Carter, the son, his face flushed with wine and a sense of untouchable power, swaggered forward. With that same cruel grin, he tipped the rest of his wine, not onto the table, but directly onto her dress, the red liquid spreading like a fresh wound. "There," he said, his voice loud enough for the back of the room to hear. "Now you finally look like you fit the color scheme." The crowd erupted. This time the applause was thunderous. Phones were raised high, some filming for the sheer sport of it. Others, Leo noticed, with a growing sense of unease. The laughter and the jeers and the clicking of phone cameras created a disorienting, nightmarish cacophony. Through it all, Serafina remained the calm center of the storm. She placed her hands flat on the damask tablecloth of a nearby serving table, steadying herself, not from fear, but to ground the colossal rage that threatened to consume her. Her voice, when she spoke again, was still low, but it held the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. "Every word you speak, every action you take, is sealing your future. Remember that," Tiffany scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair. The gesture was pure, unadulterated confidence in the power of her family's name, their fortune. "What future?" she sneered. "A future you couldn't possibly comprehend, let alone control?" Serafina didn't answer with words. She lifted her phone, a simple, understated device, and pressed a single button on her screen. She held it to her ear. Her voice was calm, clinical, utterly devoid of emotion. "Activate Protocol 7. On the other end, a voice responded instantly, crisp and professional, audible only to her. "Protocol 7 activated, Ms. Jones. The board is online. The contingency contract is standing by for your authorization." The guests blinked, confused. A few laughed again, assuming it was a pathetic, desperate bluff. A charade to save face. But Leo, the waiter in the corner, felt an icy chill snake down his spine. He had served drinks to powerful people before. He had seen the bluster of insecure men and the quiet, unshakable confidence of the truly dangerous. This woman's stillness, the chilling precision of her words. That wasn't a bluff. That was an execution order. The party thought they were watching a humiliation. They were too blind with their own arrogance to realize they were standing in the first 5 minutes of their own extinction. The ballroom was no longer filled with laughter, but with a tense, excited buzz. The whispers were like fireflies in the dark, darting through the crowd. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the performance had taken a strange turn, but the Ashworth family, high on their own perceived victory, pressed forward, doubling down on their attack. Eleanor Ashworth raised her voice, ensuring even the staff hiding in the corners could hear her proclamation. "Don't be fooled by this little sideshow, everyone. This woman is no guest. She is a grifter, a common parasite trying to scam her way into a place she could never deserve." Her words landed like a judge's sentence, and a smattering of applause followed, weaker this time, more uncertain. Serafina didn't move. She stood like a lighthouse in a hurricane, an anchor in a raging sea. But inside her mind, the storm was a vortex of memories, each one a fresh log on the fire of her resolve. Memories of being denied a business loan at 28, despite having collateral worth 3 times the requested amount. The loan officer, a man half her age with a smug Ivy League smile, had looked at her portfolio and labeled her high risk, a coded term she knew all too well. Memories of being told she couldn't possibly be the CEO of her own company when she arrived for a keynote speech, a bumbling event organizer trying to direct her to the kitchen, assuming she was with catering. The faces were always different, young, old, male, female, but the prejudice, the blind, suffocating assumption of her inferiority, was always the same. Tiffany leaned in closer, her breath smelling of champagne and self-satisfaction. "Look at her," she stage whispered to the guests nearest them. "Not a single piece of recognizable jewelry, not one designer label. That isn't quiet wealth. That's a costume. She's playing a part." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising to a crescendo. "Shall we have security escort her out ourselves?" A cheer rose from the most sycophantic corners of the room, fueled not by conviction, but by the intoxicating thrill of mob mentality. Then, a young voice, trembling but clear, sliced through the rhythm of their hate. It was Leo, the server, standing near the grand buffet table, his tray of empty glasses forgotten at his side. "I saw her name on the list," he said, his words shaky but carrying an undeniable weight of truth. She was invited. The entire room fell silent for a single, stunned beat. Tiffany's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing with fury. "You will lose your job for that lie," she spat, her voice low and dangerous. Leo's hands trembled, but he held her gaze. He thought of his tuition, of his mother's medical bills. Then he looked at Serafina, at the quiet, unyielding dignity in her eyes, and he found a strength he didn't know he had. "It's not a lie," he said, his voice stronger now. "She belongs here." The silence shattered into chaos. Half the room scoffed, dismissing him as a foolish, star-struck kid. The other half whispered furiously, doubt finally creeping into their alcohol-muddled minds. Carter sneered, pointing a finger directly at Serafina. "She belongs in the servants' quarters, not in the grand hall among us." He finally motioned for the 2 hulking security guards who had been hovering uncertainly near the entrance. "Get her out, now." The guards, dressed in immaculate black suits, approached, but there was a visible hesitation in their steps. They were paid by the Ashworths, but the scene had grown ugly, unpredictable. They had seen the phones, and they knew that an accusation of manhandling a black woman, invited guest or not, would be a PR nightmare. One guard reached for her arm, his hand large and menacing. But before his fingers could close around her bicep, Serafina's voice, as sharp and cold as breaking ice, cut through the air. "Touch me," she warned, not looking at the guard, but at Alistair Ashworth, the patriarch who was now watching from across the room. "And this family will lose more than just their reputation." The guard froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. The air crackled with tension. Eleanor's laughter echoed again, but it sounded forced now, brittle. "Listen to her threats. She really thinks she's powerful." She raised her glass to the crowd again. "This is entertainment, isn't it?" But the crowd didn't cheer, as before. An undeniable unease had settled over the room. The phones were still recording, but now their lenses felt less like instruments of mockery and more like weapons of witness. Not all of them belonged to supporters of the family anymore. Serafina calmly placed her phone back to her ear. Her voice was unwavering, a quiet command in the heart of the chaos. "Proceed to Phase 2. The voice on the other end responded with the same machine-like efficiency. "Understood, Ms. Jones. All funding contracts are being actively reviewed for breach of ethics clauses. Notifications of potential termination will reach the board members' private devices within the next 5 minutes. The family's confidence, for the first time, visibly faltered. They tried to mask it with louder insults, with more aggressive posturing. "She's bluffing," Tiffany spat, her voice a little too high, a little too shrill. Yet, for the first time all evening, her laughter didn't sound like the joyous cruelty of victory. It sounded like the panicked screech of fear trying to disguise itself as defiance. The party thought they were watching a woman be humiliated. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly comprehend yet, was the silent, methodical, and utterly devastating shift of power that was already happening. All in her favor. The crystal chandeliers glittered overhead as the Ashworths scrambled to reclaim control of a room that was rapidly slipping from their grasp. Tiffany crossed her arms, a classic posture of defiance, her smirk firmly back in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You press a button on a phone and think it means something?" she projected, her tone dripping with the innate superiority of someone who has never been told no. "This is our world, our mansion, our rules. You are a guest here. No, not even a guest. You are a mistake." The guests laughed nervously, a scattered, uncertain sound, weaker than before. Serafina offered no reply. She simply stood, perfectly still, her profound calm more unsettling than any shouting match or tearful outburst could ever be. Her silence was not surrender. It was not weakness, it was judgment. And then, the king himself stepped into the circle. Alistair Ashworth, the patriarch. Silver hair meticulously coiffed, a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed woven onto his frame, and eyes sharpened by decades of unchecked, inherited power. His voice was the voice of a man who believed the very ground he stood on belonged to him. A booming baritone accustomed to instant obedience. "You are embarrassing yourself," he declared, not just to her, but to the entire room. "This gathering is for legacy. It is not for imposters and social climbers. We built this empire. We built this wealth. You cannot buy your way into a legacy, young woman." He pointed a finger at her, a gesture so commanding he seemed to believe it could physically erase her presence. Serafina's gaze lifted slowly, deliberately, to meet his. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it resonated with a truth that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. "A legacy built on exclusion is not a legacy," she stated, each word a carefully placed stone. "It is fraud dressed up as tradition." Her words landed with a heavy thud in the silent room. And for the first time, murmurs of agreement, not mockery, stirred among the crowd. A woman in the back whispered to her husband, her voice just loud enough to be overheard. "My God, she's right." Carter, his face tight with a fury that came from being challenged for the first time in his life, stepped closer. "Enough! Security! I said remove her now!" The guards hesitated again, trapped between the son's direct order and the palpable shifting mood in the air. The phones continued to rise, a forest of silent witnesses capturing every second. From the corner, Leo the server spoke again, his voice much stronger this time, bolstered by the truth. "I told you, she is on the list. I checked it myself this afternoon." His voice didn't crack. His courage held firm. He had made his choice. Then another guest, an older man in a navy blazer with a kind, weathered face, added his voice to the chorus of dissent. "The young man is correct. I saw her name as well. Serafina Jones. She was the guest of honor." The daughter's eyes widened. Guest of honor? The narrative wasn't just slipping from their grasp. It was shattering. Eleanor Ashworth scoffed, a desperate, dismissive sound. "Don't let these nobodies sway you. He's a waiter. She's nothing. She will always be nothing." She lunged forward, her carefully constructed mask of civility finally cracking, and with a viciousness that shocked the room, she tried to grab Serafina's arm to physically drag her away. A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. The woman did not resist the grab. She simply turned her head, her eyes as cold and hard as obsidian. "That," she said, her voice a low promise, "is your last mistake." Her phone buzzed softly in her palm. The voice on the other end was clear, efficient, and utterly final. "Phase 2 complete, Ms. Jones. Documentation is locked. Live streams from the event have been secured. The board is watching a direct feed as we speak." Alistair Ashworth's face went pale. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of confusion and a dawning, terrible fear. He didn't yet understand the full scope of the catastrophe unfolding, but he knew enough to feel the solid marble floor beginning to shift beneath his feet. The guests began to stir, no longer comfortable with the spectacle. What had started as a bit of cruel entertainment now felt like an exposure, and they feared they were on the wrong side of it. Serafina's voice carried again, not loud but firm and clear for all to hear. "You mocked me in a house that was funded by my investments. You poured wine on the dress of the woman who signed the checks that keep these very lights burning. Tonight, your arrogance is not your shield. It is your undoing." The crowd murmured, a low, stunned hum. Phones flashed, capturing the dawning horror on the faces of the Ashworth family. The once celebrated, untouchable dynasty stood frozen, their laughter gone, their power unraveling thread by thread in front of the very people they sought to impress. The mansion was no longer their fortress. It was rapidly becoming their stage of reckoning. Tiffany Ashworth's laughter cracked, a sound as sharp and brittle as spun glass. She was trying to regain her footing, to project an authority she could feel bleeding away with every passing second. "Do you really believe anyone in this room cares about your empty, pathetic threats?" she sneered, lifting her glass high, a desperate call for her supporters to rally. But the applause that had once followed her every word came only in disjointed fragments. A few people clapped, more out of habit than conviction. Many more lowered their eyes, suddenly unwilling to be part of the cruelty any longer. Serafina remained centered in the storm, an unmovable object. She had endured this exact tone of dismissive contempt 1,000 times before. At 16, she'd been turned away from the local country club where her white friends were members, told by a man with a sneer identical to Tiffany's that the members' lounge was for families only. At 25, she'd been laughed out of a venture capital pitch because she wore plain, functional heels instead of a luxury label that signaled she was already part of their club. The message was always the same, whether spoken or implied. You do not belong. But every single rejection, every sneer, every dismissal had not broken her. It had forged her resolve into something harder than steel. Tonight was not just another rejection. Tonight would be the night the entire rotten structure finally collapsed on those who had built it. Alistair Ashworth himself stepped closer, his hand trembling so violently that the ice in his whiskey glass rattled. He strained to keep his voice commanding, but a tremor of fear ran through it. Enough of this. You will leave my house now, or I will have you escorted out like the impostor you are. His eyes frantically searched the crowd, not for confirmation anymore, but for approval, for anyone to side with him. He found only the cold, unforgiving lenses of raised phones and the silent, mounting judgment in 100 pairs of eyes. Leo, the young server, did not back down. Emboldened, he stepped forward from the shadows of the buffet table into the circle of light. His apron was stained, but his voice was pure and clear. You are wrong, sir. She is not an impostor. He took a deep breath. I saw her name printed in bold on the master guest list. It was at the very top. It was marked Priority Alpha. His words landed like stones in a silent pool, sending ripples of shock and understanding through the entire room. Gasps spread across the ballroom. A woman in a crimson gown, who had been laughing the loudest just minutes before, whispered to her companion, Priority Alpha? My God! Then who is she? Eleanor Ashworth spun toward the server, her face a mask of raw, unfiltered fury. You will be fired for this! Fired and blacklisted! You will never work in this city again! But before her toxic words could crush him, another voice joined the defense. It came from the older guest in the tailored navy suit, a man known for his quiet integrity and substantial influence. His voice was calm, measured, and carried the weight of authority. I saw her name too, Eleanor, and I assure you, if you continue this appalling disgrace, it will not be her reputation that is ruined by morning. It will be yours. The room shifted. It was a palpable change, like the tectonic plates of power grinding against each other. The balance had cracked. The once unshakable Ashworth family was now surrounded not by adoring sycophants, but by witnesses who were no longer afraid to stand against them. Seraphina's phone buzzed again in her palm, a soft, insistent vibration. She pressed it to her ear. Status. The voice that answered was steady, professional, and utterly remorseless. Phase 3 is complete, Ms. Jones. All revolving credit lines have been frozen. The $5 billion commitment for the Ashworth Legacy Tower has been suspended, pending review. The legal team has been formally notified of a hostile partner environment. Tiffany Ashworth went white. The smirk on her face didn't just fade. It collapsed, crumbling into an expression of raw, primal fear. You can't do that, she stammered, the words catching in her throat. You wouldn't dare. Seraphina's eyes, cold and clear, met hers. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, profound sorrow for the ugliness that had brought them to this point. I already did. A heavy, absolute silence consumed the ballroom. Every single guest felt it, the unmistakable, irreversible shift of power, the fall of a dynasty, happening not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but here, in real time, under the glittering lights of their own monument to arrogance. The Legacy Gala had begun as their ultimate display of dominance. It was now, officially, her stage of justice. Carter Ashworth's face turned a blotchy, furious crimson as the terrifying weight of her words finally sank through his thick skull of privilege. He slammed his fist down on a nearby table with such force that crystal glasses rattled and one tipped over, spilling its contents. The act drew a series of nervous gasps from the guests. You think you can embarrass us in our own home? He roared, his voice cracking with a rage that was clearly not strength. It was the panicked flailing of a man drowning in consequences he never imagined could touch him. "You are nothing but a fraud in borrowed shoes." Serafina did not move. Her stillness was a counterpoint to his frantic rage, and it only deepened the pervasive unease in the room. When she finally spoke, her words were deliberate, measured, each one a perfectly aimed dart. "Fraud requires deception, Mr. Ashworth. I have done nothing tonight but stand here and endure yours." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You mistook my silence for permission. That will be your last mistake." Eleanor, clutching the diamond necklace at her throat as if it were a life preserver, sneered, a pathetic attempt to reclaim her authority. "Do you hear her? She thinks she owns the very air in this room. She thinks she owns us." Her attempt at mockery came out weaker than before, her confidence bleeding away into raw desperation. And then it happened. An act so vile, so beyond the pale, that it would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. With a calculated, venomous cruelty, Tiffany lifted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and poured it slowly, deliberately, over Serafina's head. The golden, bubbling liquid streamed down her hair, dripped onto her face, and soaked the shoulders of her dress, all under the brilliant, unforgiving light of the chandeliers. "There," Tiffany spat, her lips pulled back in a venomous grin. "Now you sparkle." A fractured, uneasy laughter erupted again. But this time it was different. It was the sound of discomfort, of shock. Some laughed to mask their own horror. Others shifted awkwardly, their phones still recording, but no longer certain they wanted to be part of this grotesque spectacle. Leo's voice rose again, trembling not with fear this time, but with outrage. "Stop it!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the tense silence that followed. "You can't treat another human being this way." His defiance drew dozens of stares. Tiffany whirled on him, her words like poison darts. "You will regret ever opening your mouth, you little peasant." But the damage was done. The cruelty was now undeniable, visceral, and captured on 100 different screens. Serafina calmly, gracefully, wiped the champagne from her eyes. Her expression was serene, almost regal. She spoke softly, yet every syllable carried with the force of a thunderclap across the silent ballroom. "You poured your contempt on me in front of all your friends. You celebrated it as if it were entertainment, and you believed in the deepest part of your souls that no one would ever hold you accountable." She took a single step forward. "Watch closely. Your belief ends tonight." Her phone vibrated again. A single, sharp pulse. She lifted it. The voice on the other end was crisp, efficient, final. "Legal filings have been time-stamped, Ms. Jones. Board confirmations have been received. A curated package of evidence, including multiple live feeds from this event, has been delivered to our media contacts at the Associated Press, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. They are on standby." Alistair Ashworth staggered a step back, his hand tightening around his whiskey glass so hard it was a wonder it didn't shatter. What have you done?" His question was no longer one of defiance. It was a whisper of pure, unadulterated dread. Serafina's reply was calm, almost gentle, which made it all the more devastating. "I have done what you and your family forced me to do. I have reminded you that real power does not lie in mockery, or in bloodlines, or in gilded mansions. Real power lies in truth. It lies in justice. And it lies in the consequences you never, ever thought would come for you." The guests fell utterly silent. The only sounds in the grand ballroom were the faint electronic hum of phones still recording and the ragged, panicked breathing of a family watching their entire empire slip through their fingers in the very hall they had built to celebrate its permanence. The reckoning was no longer approaching. It was here. It had arrived. The Ashworth mansion had never been so quiet. The grand chandeliers, which once sparkled as symbols of immense power and untouchable wealth, now hung like silent, judging witnesses in the heavy air. The guests, who had arrived seeking glamour and gossip, now clutched their phones as if they were shields, their faces a mixture of awe, horror, and a strange, thrilling sense of justice being served. Every eye was fixed on Seraphina Jones. She stood at the center of the room, her simple dress drenched in expensive wine and champagne. Yet she radiated a composure so absolute, so profound, that it eclipsed every diamond, every fortune in the room. Tiffany, trembling but still unwilling to admit total defeat, hissed through clenched teeth, her voice a ragged whisper of defiance. "Do you really think a few phone calls and some empty threats can undo generations of legacy?" She tried to laugh, but the sound that came out was hollow, a dry, rattling sound that was only trying to mask the sheer terror in her eyes. Seraphina lifted her phone one final time. She didn't put it to her ear. She held it in front of her, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Confirm execution," she said, her voice steady, her tone final. The reply came at once from the phone's speaker, clear and undeniable for all to hear. "Execution confirmed, Ms. Jones. Phase 4 is initiated. All personal and trust accounts linked to the Ashworth family name are now frozen, pending a full ethics and conduct investigation. The $5 billion withdrawal from all future joint commitments is now processed and effective, immediately." A wave of gasps erupted around the room. It was real. A man in a tuxedo turned to his wife, his eyes wide, and whispered, "My God, she actually did it." Another guest, a rival investor, raised his phone higher, ensuring he captured the precise moment Carter Ashworth's confident smirk finally collapsed into a mask of slack-jawed panic. Eleanor lurched forward, desperation making her movements clumsy. "You can't do this! Those agreements are ironclad! They're binding!" Seraphina met her gaze calmly, her eyes holding a universe of disappointment. "They were binding until tonight, Eleanor. But arrogance voids loyalty, and blatant disrespect voids trust." Leo, the young server, now standing near the edge of the inner circle, spoke again, his voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "I told you all," he said, his voice stronger and prouder with each word. "I told you she belongs here." This time several guests nodded in vigorous agreement, no longer whispering, but openly voicing their support. A small ripple of applause started near the back, a sound that spread through the crowd, not for the spectacle, but for the woman who had brought the arrogant to their knees. The Ashworth family found themselves utterly alone, surrounded not by adoration, but by witnesses to their disgrace, unwilling to stay silent any longer. Alistair Ashworth, the patriarch, tried one last time to summon the authority that had defined his entire life. His voice was unsteady. "Reedy, you will regret crossing us. No one humiliates this family and walks away unscathed." He pointed a trembling finger at her, a pathetic, powerless gesture. Seraphina's reply was sharp, deliberate, and devastating. "You called me a fraud in a mansion that my investments keep afloat. You poured your contempt on me in front of hundreds of witnesses, and now you dare speak to me of humiliation?" She shook her head slowly. "No, tonight you don't speak of it. Tonight you will finally taste the cost of it." As if on cue, phones began to buzz and chime all across the ballroom. News alerts were pinging on every screen. Headlines appeared in real time, stark and brutal in their efficiency. Ashworth Empire shaken by $5 billion investor. Pull-out major investor Seraphina Jones cuts all ties with Ashworth Corp. During Mansion Gala, video emerges of Ashworth family assaulting guest of honor. Guests showed each other their screens, their faces alight with the shocking, undeniable truth. The story was already out, spreading beyond the manicured lawns and high walls of the estate, racing across the globe at the speed of light. Tiffany's voice finally broke, a shrill, pathetic cry of fear. "Stop this, please! We didn't mean—" But her words crumbled into a strangled sob as the full, crushing weight of the truth pressed down on her. Serafina did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Meaningless apologies do not erase deliberate cruelty," she said, her voice a calm indictment. "Tonight, you mocked me as if my very presence were a trespass, but the only trespass here, the only violation, is your belief that power and privilege could shield you from consequence. That shield is now broken." The guests watched, spellbound. Justice had not arrived in a courtroom tomorrow or in a newspaper headline next week. It was unfolding in real time, right here, right now, under the glittering chandeliers of a mansion that no longer felt like it belonged to the family cowering within it. Carter Ashworth staggered back a step, his athletic confidence completely drained, replaced by the pale, clammy sweat of reality sinking in. His voice cracked as he shouted, a desperate, last-ditch legal threat. "This is illegal. You can't just strip away $5 billion from our future. You will answer for this in court." Serafina turned her head slowly to face him, her eyes calm and unyielding, the eyes of a master strategist who is already 10 moves ahead. "What you call illegal, Mr. Ashworth, is accountability. The contracts you signed, the ones your high-priced lawyers drafted, carry clauses for conduct, for ethics, for professional standards you and your family chose to spectacularly ignore tonight. Every clause you violated now activates because of your own arrogance." Her words rang with the clarity of a bell, slicing through the thick hush of the ballroom. Eleanor clutched her pearls, a reflexive, useless gesture, as though holding them could somehow hold back the flood of truth. "Don't listen to her. She's bluffing. She has to be." Yet, even as she spoke the desperate words, her own phone, a diamond-encrusted smartphone, buzzed incessantly in her clutch. She glanced down, and all the color drained from her face. Her screen was a waterfall of notifications. Funding pulled. Contracts terminated. Legal audits initiated. Partnership dissolved. Her hand trembled so violently she nearly dropped the device. The guests leaned closer to one another, murmuring in a low, continuous hum. The man in the navy blazer whispered to his wife, his voice filled with awe. "She isn't bluffing. She doesn't own a piece of the power here. She owns all of it." A woman in a silver gown, who was now broadcasting live to her thousands of followers, narrated the scene in a hushed, excited voice. "This is happening right now, people. You are watching history. She is dismantling an American dynasty in front of our very eyes." Alastair himself tried to rally one final, pathetic time. He slammed his hand down on a table, rattling the glasses. "We are untouchable. Our legacy spans generations. Do you think one person can erase all of that in a single night?" Serafina lifted her chin, her voice imbued with a power that came not from money, but from profound, hard-won truth. Generations built on exclusion and hatred collapse much faster than you think. You are not untouchable. You are, for the first time in your lives, utterly exposed. Leo, the server, stepped closer, his voice louder now, emboldened by the undeniable shift in the room. "She is telling the truth. She is the reason this mansion exists. I saw the financial reports when I was helping in the office. Without her funding, without her name, none of this would stand." His words rippled outward, and this time several guests began to clap. Not a slow, uncertain clap, but a firm, supportive applause. The daughter's face twisted with desperation. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of pleading. "You can't do this! You can't take everything away! Please, we can make this right! We'll apologize!" Serafina's gaze was unwavering. There was no pity in it, only a final, resounding judgment. "You mocked me for my skin. You assaulted me for my dress. You laughed at me for daring to stand among you. You poured your contempt as freely and as carelessly as you poured your champagne, and you believed, with every fiber of your being, that no one would ever stop you." She paused, letting the finality of her next words settle over them like a shroud. "Tonight I stopped you." The ballroom shook, not with applause, but with a silence heavier than stone. The guests recorded every moment, their screens capturing a dynasty unraveling in high definition. The family that had ruled their world with unchecked casual arrogance now stood cornered, exposed, and utterly powerless. Serafina's phone buzzed one final time. She raised it to her ear, a gesture of ultimate finality. The voice on the line was precise, undeniable. "All funding has been officially cut, Ms. Jones. The $5 billion has been redirected. Their empire, as it stood this morning, is finished." She lowered the phone, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the room. "Power," she said, her voice a lesson for everyone present, "is not inherited. It is earned, and tonight yours is gone." The guests did not cheer. They simply watched, silent witnesses to a fall so complete, so absolute, that its echoes would be felt long after the last of the music had stopped for good. The mansion, once a stage for their ostentatious celebration, now resembled a courtroom where judgment had already been delivered. The Ashworth family stood frozen in the center of their own party, stripped not of their expensive clothes or their glittering jewels, but of their authority, their power, their very identity. Their titles and fortunes no longer carried any weight in this room. All that remained was fear, naked and undeniable. Serafina Jones took a single step forward, her heels echoing against the marble floor like the beat of a final verdict. "You believed your wealth made you invincible. You believed your cruelty could be disguised as tradition. Tonight, both of those illusions end." Her voice was steady, a blade wrapped in velvet. The phones across the ballroom continued to record, capturing the historic fall in real time. Guests who had once clinked glasses with the Ashworths now whispered furiously among themselves, their eyes sharp with a terrible, thrilling recognition. A woman in a sapphire gown, a prominent socialite, muttered to her husband, "They laughed at her for being here, but the truth is, she owns everything under this very roof." Her companion, a hedge fund manager, nodded gravely. "Owned. Past tense, and now she has taken it all back." Carter, in a final pathetic burst of impotent defiance, lunged forward, but one of the security guards, the same one who had hesitated to touch her earlier, instinctively moved to restrain him, his grip firm. The guard's expression said everything. He knew where the power now resided, and it was no longer with the family who signed his paychecks. The son's shout broke across the profound silence. "This is not over. You can't erase us." Serafina turned toward him, her gaze like polished steel. "You erased yourselves," she said, her voice cutting through his pathetic rage. "You erased yourselves the moment you chose hatred over humanity, arrogance over dignity. Tonight, I am only signing the paperwork." Her phone buzzed again. She lifted it, and the voice on the other end was crisp, unshakable, and broadcast for all to hear. "All access badges have been revoked, Ms. Jones. Their corporate and personal accounts are locked. Our legal teams have been dispatched to their offices and residences. The system is closed." Eleanor gasped as her phone, which she'd retrieved, chimed repeatedly in her clutch. Each notification was another door slamming shut in her face. Assets frozen, contracts terminated, invitations rescinded. She finally dropped the phone to the floor, where its diamonds glittered uselessly as her hands trembled too much to hold it. Then Leo, the young server, who had spoken all along with a courage that belied his years, stepped closer. His voice rang through the room, steadier than it had ever been. You called her nothing. You mocked her as if she did not belong. But tonight we all see who truly did not belong in a world of decency and respect. His words ignited murmurs of agreement. Louder now, bolder. Some guests clapped, and others raised their voices in open support. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave, and the Ashworths were drowning in it. Alistair himself lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of his humiliation. This was not simply a financial loss. This was the complete and utter unraveling of an empire built on the rotten foundation of inherited arrogance. Serafina addressed the room one final time, her tone resolute, a promise of what was to come. $5 billion has been cut from their name. Their contracts have been dissolved. Their influence has ended. But that money is not gone. A new light came into her eyes, a fire not of vengeance, but of creation. That $5 billion, as of 1 minute ago, has become the seed funding for the Dignity in Business Foundation, which will provide grants and scholarships to entrepreneurs and students from communities that families like the Ashworths have spent generations trying to keep out. The ballroom erupted. This time, the applause was not for a downfall, but for a rebirth. It was not wild, but steady, certain, and powerful. It was the sound of justice recognized, of a better world being built from the ashes of a hateful one. The family stood pale and trembling, surrounded not by admirers, but by witnesses to their final, pathetic downfall. And in that moment, the mansion ceased to be theirs. It belonged to the truth that had finally come due. The applause faded into a steady, charged silence, as if the very walls of the mansion held their breath. The chandeliers sparkled above, but the light no longer crowned the Ashworths. It illuminated their ruin. Tiffany stood with her arms wrapped around herself. Her earlier arrogance dissolved into a trembling, hollow shame. Carter avoided every camera lens, his fists clenched with a rage that could no longer disguise his utter defeat. Eleanor's diamonds no longer glittered with pride, but with the dead weight of futility. And Alistair, the patriarch, stared at the marble floor, his entire legacy stripped away in the same hall where he once paraded it. Serafina stood tall in the center of it all. Her dress was stained, her hair was damp, but her dignity was a suit of armor no insult could ever penetrate. She did not smile, for this was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a reckoning that had been overdue for generations. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting those of the guests who had watched, who had filmed, and who had slowly but surely chosen the side of justice. Her voice rose, calm but unshakable. I don't need your applause. I don't need your sympathy. What I need is for every single one of you to remember this night. Remember how quickly arrogance collapses when confronted by truth. Remember how easily cruelty consumes itself. She looked directly at the broken family. You mocked me for my skin. You assaulted me for my presence. You laughed at me for daring to exist in your space. And now, your space is gone. The guests listened, breathless. Some nodded, others wiped at their eyes, struck not only by her power, but by the profound, unshakable truth of her words. Leo, the young server, stood straighter, a quiet pride filling his chest. He had been terrified, but he had chosen the right side of history. Serafina turned towards the family one last time. Her voice was not raised, but every syllable cut through the ballroom like a diamond. I don't need to film your humiliation. I don't need to prove you wrong. I am the proof. I am the result of a world you tried to build but could not control. And tonight, you are the reminder to everyone else that power without dignity is, and always will be, absolutely nothing. She turned and stepped toward the grand doors. The crowd of millionaires and billionaires parted for her like the Red Sea, not as if she were a guest, but as if she were the rightful owner of the very air they breathed. The phones followed her, capturing every step, every breath of the quiet, immense authority that clung to her as she moved. At the threshold, she paused and looked back just once. The family huddled together, looking smaller and more pathetic than they had ever appeared in their lives. Her final words echoed against the marble and gold, a promise and a warning for all time. I don't need to stay. The lesson will. With that, she walked out into the cool night air, leaving the doors to close softly behind her. She left the family in the ruins of their own making, and the guests forever changed by what they had witnessed. The mansion had begun the night as the Ashworth's fortress. It ended as her courtroom. And justice had been delivered, not with a gavel or a shout, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of truth. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming the power that was yours all along. If this story resonated with you, if it sparked something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their dignity is not up for debate. And please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, but empower. Thank you for being a part of this community. Until next time, remember your worth.